Hey, it's Joe, and welcome to another episode of the Test Guild Automation Podcast. And you're in for a special treat. I cannot believe I have not had John on the podcast before. So today we'll be talking with John Ferguson Smart all about BDD in action, the go-to book I always recommend for anyone having to do anything with BDD or even automation because it dovetails both so perfectly. So if you don't know, John Ferguson Smart is a specialist in BDD, automation testing, and software lifecycle development optimization. He is the founder of the Serenity Dojo, which is an awesome online training platform for testers who really want world-class agile test automation engineers, how to become one. It shows you how to do that. And he is the creator of the BDD or the Serenity BDD test automation framework. You don't want to miss this episode. Check it out. This episode of the Test Guild Automation Podcast is sponsored by the Test Guild. Test Guild offers amazing partnership plans that cater to your brand awareness, lead generation, and thought leadership goals. Get your products and services in front of your ideal target audience. Our satisfied clients rave about the results they've seen from partnering with us, from boosted event attendance to impressive ROI. Visit our website and let's talk about how Test Guild can take your brand to the next level. Head on over to testguild.info and let's talk. Hey, John, welcome to the Guild.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
It's great to have you. Really excited. Yeah. I can't believe it's over 9 years, still haven't had you. So today's the day. Really excited. John, I always botch bio. So is there anything I missed in your bio that you want the Guild to know more about?
You covered a lot of stuff. You covered a lot of material, but that's basically what I do. I help teams communicate better and do better test automation. And I try and run the Serenity Dojo, which helps testers become top world-class test automation engineers. We use sort of education science and all sorts of fairly pretty cool stuff to we've come up with a program which I think is pretty original. I don't know anyone else who really teaches that way, and it does work really well.
So why is that? What is education science then? Or is that your secret sauce that you can't reveal?
It's a secret sauce. But basically, what I found was that I was training testers I've been training testers for quite a while, and I was using the usual sort of boot camp standard course type approaches, and especially in corporate context, but even with individuals, I found that sort of very structured approach never really, it feels good, but it doesn't sink in. A lot of people sort of afterwards, they go back to their old habits or they go back to their old ways, or they don't really adopt the learning that I was trying to commit to. So I actually had a conversation one time when I was in Sydney with a friend of mine from high school, in fact, who is now very knowledgeable in education science. And he showed me some techniques which basically throw all of the conventional boot camp training approaches away and use a much more intuitive, natural way of learning. Flips everything around and is really, really effective. And sort of I started doing that in a corporate context in companies that I was working for, and then started using it for individuals. And it works really well. So I'm really pleased with the outcomes it gets people. They're getting promotions, they're getting new jobs, they're getting more job satisfaction. And it's really good to see just the way when you see them posting things on LinkedIn or talking about what they're doing, actually practicing the practices that we sort of often talk about and doing things properly and helping other people as well. So it's really satisfying.
That's awesome. I get asked all the time, hey, are there any good boot camps I should go to? Or I don't know anything about automation. What should I do? So is the Serenity Dojo appropriate to all types of levels, or do you need some sort of proficiency in automation before entering the dojo?
Because it's a tailored approach, it works for all levels. We've got people coming from purely non-technical manual backgrounds with no coding skills at all, and we bring them up to speed in Java and JavaScript, and we're doing Python soon, and whatever is the most appropriate tool for them. And for more experienced testers, or even we've got some managers or Scrum Masters or sort of QA managers who come on the program as well, who want to understand what the automation is all about, what the automation their teams are supposed to be doing, and to be able to advise them and direct them a bit better. So it really does cater for all levels.
Great. And John, I assume you're still a believer in behavior-driven development. This is one of those topics that drive me mad, especially online, where I think people really don't understand it, and especially when automation gets involved. So can you just tell me a little bit more, what is behavior-driven development? How did you get involved with it? And why do you seem to be such a great proponent of it?
For me, behavior-driven development is basically agile done well, with a whole lot of practices around getting collaboration and communication, actually making it effective, basically. So there is the side of, so traditionally we say BDD evolved from TDD because it came from Dan North teaching TDD and figuring out that if you didn't actually talk about tests, you could teach the concept a lot better. But since then, that was in the mid 2000s, the noughties. Since then, it's evolved a lot and become very much a team level collaboration practice. And there is a strong association in people's minds with tools like Cucumber and Gherkin, but really, if tomorrow we get a better tool than Gherkin and find some other way of automating our specifications, and we're still doing BDD, it's really a collaboration practice, a flow, a way of getting teams to articulate their requirements and agree on their requirements, and then express those requirements in a way that flows naturally into automated tests. And that gives, for one thing, it makes it much easier to do automation because you can streamline the automation process and actually do in-sprint automation a lot more easily, because effectively you're doing, there's a whole lot of acronyms, but you're basically doing test-driven development at a domain level. You're designing the examples and the that you want to show to your product owner or your users or your stakeholders at the end of a release or at the end of a sprint. What are the examples you want to show that will provide evidence that you've actually delivered something? Let's automate them in a way that they will understand. And everything starts from there. So you flip things around. You say, right, what are we going to demonstrate? Let's build the automation to show that, demonstrate that. And then, sure, you can do other automation under the hood, and you'll often do TDD at a more granular level. But it's what I call this table stakes. You get that's the minimum automation that you should be doing, and then that frees you up for exploratory testing and other stuff as well.
Absolutely. So you mentioned communication is key. I love that. BDD is agile done well. That's a great quote by you. So do you find teams struggling with communication, and that's why somehow their BDDs or automation gets kind of wonky at some point because they kind of miss out on that key point is communication?
If you get clarity on requirements across the whole team, you get a whole lot of defects that just don't exist, that don't happen, that would normally have happened. And conversely, when you work in a siloed way, which is what happens when we don't get the communication work, even if we're doing Scrum, if we've got developers working separately from testers pick up the pieces and then test, you get that disconnect, and you get that trying to play catch up or trying to the whole unplanned rework, which we're in the lean world in Kanban that we're trying to avoid. That's where it all comes from, that misinterpretation or misunderstanding or lack of clarity around what the requirements are. Or if the requirements come into a sprint, come into a team, and then the product owner might not have clarity on them. But the product owner, I remember that's a really interesting animated conversation stand up a few months back where the product owner was adamant that the requirements were clear, but the developers were not so adamant. So their definition of clear requirements, or what was the word they were using? It was a word that I felt like saying the Princess Bride quote. But you do get, when you do BDD properly, the whole point of that is to take a requirement and say, right, well, this is what we think it's supposed to do. Have we understood this correctly? What are the assumptions? Let's walk through this and make sure we're all on the same page. And let's not just do it as a random conversation, but do it in a structured way so we can come up with a few key examples and counter examples and And it does take more effort initially because it forces you to sit down and think. But that pays off because you've got that clarity about what you want to build. And that's where you get like teams doing BDD well. They get 80, 90% fewer defects. They don't get production incidents. They deliver much faster or get much, even though they're spending more time thinking about what they have to do or talking about what they have to do initially, they end up delivering a lot faster because there's not that back and forth and uncertainty and rework that happens. I mean, it is the whole concept of agile collaboration, face-to-face communication, but putting in place a whole lot of structure to make that happen and to make that effective.
Absolutely. And, you mentioned structure. So I think that's another kind of hurdle for people is not only communication, but then like, how do I incorporate BDD with Selenium or whatever automation I'm using in the background? And that's where I think Serenity comes in. Serenity gives people almost like the scaffolding for everything they need for BDD in a way that I think kind of not makes it easier, but kind of facilitates how to do BDD correctly. So I guess first, can you talk a little bit about Serenity? Gosh, I guess it's been around for 8-9 years now. It's the framework I used when I was actually working as a automation engineer at GE way back. So a little bit more about Serenity and how maybe it can help make BDD easier for people.
Yeah, well, Serenity actually it doesn't predate BDD, but the first version of Serenity were BDD without Cucumber. That was just pure JUnit. But the idea has always been that it's a living documentation tool. So how can you write tests? How can you write automation in a way that actually communicates to the business and provides evidence of what you've actually tested? And now it works with obviously with Cucumber. Also, there's Serenity JS that my colleague and friend Jan Molek's written, where you can use TypeScript, and integrate with any of the sort of Node.js tools and get the same sort of outcomes. So the big thing with Serenity is that a lot of people often ask, well, so I understand that the BDD scenarios are meant to not commit to the implementation too much, not talk about clicking here and clicking there and not being full of UI stuff. But how do we provide evidence to our users or our customers or our stakeholders that of what's actually being tested? I mean, I work a lot in banks and they're all about, they have to have evidence of what was released. And so that's what Serenity does. It documents the steps in business terms from the Cucumber level, or even if it's with JUnit or Mocha or whatever, from the test automation level, it documents each layer going down, right down to the API calls or the clicks or the database queries or whatever, however you're interacting with the system. At each step, it explains what that was trying to achieve. So it's very much built around the whole concept of where tests should not model the application. They should model the behavior of the user that you're trying to simulate. And so you want your test to map out the user journey and document that user journey, both from a high level and at a very granular level. So that's what Serenity is all about, being able to provide that evidence and that documentation. And it does, along the way, it adds a whole lot of, at the moment, it's mostly Selenium, except in the Serenity JS, which does Playwright and I think Cypress as well now. I think he's integrated with Cypress, possibly. I'm not 100% sure on that one. But WebDriver IO, I think, as well. On the Java side, there is a POC for integrating it with Playwright. I've just got to get around to finishing it. But that's on the way because Playwright it does work in Java as well. But it works with Rest Assured, obviously. So it's not real. It integrates with other testing tools to provide that layer of living documentation and that structure around the test and that reporting that otherwise you'd have to set up yourself.
All right, so that's another piece I think people don't get is that that really drew me to Serenity is the documentation piece. And when done in the way you mentioned is you get living documentation not only for your users, but if you have a new tester come on board or something, if you do it correctly, they could read the output of your test and learn the system on the test almost. So it's like it has multi benefits when done correctly. And when you work for like a healthcare system like I did, if you get audited, rather than have them look at the code, you just show them the output of your test, and it should be, it'd be written out in a way that they could follow along to see what was tested and what was verified. So is that correct? Why one of the main benefits? Yeah,
absolutely. Yep. So again, like I said, I work in banks. There's a lot of compliance questions, a lot of how do you actually document the, other than creating a Word document with lots of screenshots, we can also do it automatically.
So this brings in, I think, the main event here, and that is BDD in action. I have the first edition. As you can see, it's highly, well, for the people that watch on YouTube, not the people that are listening, I have dog ears all over the place for this book. It saved my life when I was working, like I said, full-time as an automation engineer. So, John, to me, this book was so complete, and like I recommend it to everyone. Why a second edition? How could you expand on and make better what I thought was like what I would recommend as the go-to book for anything to do with BDD or automation?
Well, it came out in 2013, 2014. A lot of techniques have emerged in sort of the BDD world since then. So at the time the techniques that we used have evolved. At the time we would write given when then Gherkin scenarios directly in Three Amigos. Now we tend to do things like example mapping or feature mapping or other techniques, other brainstorming techniques. We use Figma or Miro online to come up to work around the ideas and brainstorm the examples and counterexamples. So there's a whole lot of collaboration techniques that have emerged that I thought it was important to document that weren't around when the first edition came out. So that was the biggest thing. It wasn't intended to take so long I think I came up with the idea in about 2000 and maybe 17 or 18 to do a second edition. So it took a little bit longer than I thought it would. It was one of those projects where we do this not because it's the right thing, but because we thought it would be easy.
So what else was added then? Why did it take so long then? Was it just because life happens?
Because we basically re-updated every single chapter. And also I got Jan Mullock to come in and do some stuff on TypeScript and Serenity JS. We did several chapters on the Screenplay pattern, which has emerged since, which was around, but has really sort of become a bit more mainstream since then. We've introduced example mapping, journey mapping, feature mapping, all of these collaboration practices. We talk a little bit more about microservices and microservice architectures. So every chapter pretty much has been, and all of the code examples obviously have been updated and with the latest versions. So it's pretty much a total overhaul. The title stayed the same.
Nice. So, like you said, when this book came out, Serenity JS, I don't think was even in existence yet. So, is it the same tool, or is it basically like how does someone choose then? I guess if they're using Java, they use Serenity. If they want to use JS, they use just Serenity JS. Do they have are they exactly in parallel with the features and such? Other than what you mentioned is one has may support for WebDriver IO and the other one has Playwright, where Serenity is still doesn't have that support as of yet.
So the main differences are Serenity JS is a pure Screenplay implementation. Serenity has Screenplay plus the action classes model, which is basically classes that you use to document your steps and methods, and they get documented in the reports. And then inside the steps, you can use more traditional page objects, whereas Screenplay is Screenplay. In Serenity JS, it's Screenplay with TypeScript, which is very elegant to use. It's a really nice combination of tools. The reporting is more or less identical. It's the same reporting engine. The Screenplay APIs are slightly different, but Screenplay looks like Screenplay no matter what language you're using. So even Andy Knight's Python implementation looks like Serenity. Every Screenplay implementation looks very similar. So there's not too much difference there. It's fairly easy to go between one or the other. So the real choice is what you're more comfortable with. If you're more comfortable with in the Java environment, if your builds are if you're building Spring Boot microservices or some backend services, and Serenity is probably a good choice. And if you're building more in a Node.js environment, or if you're doing a lot of front end stuff, and you've got a Node npm type pipeline, then Serenity JS is a great choice.
So I guess for the folks that don't know the Screenplay, you've been talking about the Screenplay pattern forever. I think you did a session on the original Automation Guild, but it seems to be just starting to take off now, even though it's been around for a while. So for the folks that don't know, what is the Screenplay pattern? How is it different from the page object model?
So we do often compare Screenplay to page objects, but really, when you think about it, comparing Screenplay to page objects is kind of like comparing functional programming to encapsulation. It's the Screenplay pattern. It's not a design pattern in the same way that a page object is a design pattern. It's more a paradigm. It's a way of thinking. So it's more like functional programming for automation in some ways, because the Screenplay pattern, it changes the way you model your tests, or you think about your tests. So rather than modeling the user interface that you interact with, and then having your tests just talk in terms of what the user interface is doing, you think in terms of what are the tasks that the users are trying to achieve, and how are they going to go about achieving those tasks. And then at some point you will interact with, you will do clicks and selects and enter values in forms and interact with drop downs and so forth. You'll get to that at some point, but it's part of a task, not part of a page. Because in modern applications, the concept of a page is a little bit nebulous. And so you're really talking about groups of related fields that will change at the same time. That's sort of more what you're interested in. And then you're more interested in how does the user interact with those fields or those elements. And when you model your test in terms of user behavior, you not only get a lot more reuse because you're reusing blocks that are more natural, sort of like you build Lego blocks around what the user does in business terms. So does the user, or if we think a simple example, does the user add an item to the shopping cart? Does the user check out an item? Does the user save an item to their wish list? All of those concepts, you can model them as signal objects or as signal tasks, and then reuse them. And then you can configure them so that you can reuse them with slight variations. And then you can also, that frees you up from in the page object model, when you're working a lot with page objects, you're thinking in terms of pages. You're thinking in terms of UI interactions. But if you're thinking in terms of tasks, you don't necessarily have to have a UI. It could be going through an API. It could go through a UI or an API, depending on the context. So you get a lot more flexibility about how you actually implement your tests. So that's the idea of the Screenplay pattern. It's a way of testing that models the user behavior rather than the user interface.
And John, what I love about you is, like you said, you speak with multiple enterprises, you speak with all types of companies as well, big, small, large, and you've been using the Screenplay pattern for a while. Last time we spoke was at an Automation Guild, and I forgot what the percentage was, but in a real world example from a very large application, you said the Screenplay pattern saved, I thought it was I don't know if it was 20 or 40% of time, but do you have any examples of how much the Screenplay pattern can help with automation, even the creation of it or the maintenance?
I do. I had an example that was 50% recently. Literally the real live. I mean, once you scale it, the thing is you scale it. When it's a large application, you can get that sort of figures because you get a lot, not just the Screenplay, but the quality of the task and the components tends to go up because it encourages really good habits and really good design patterns, really nice code, and makes it easier to scale at that level. So the code tends to be more concise and more focused. And so you get I think a lot of the saving comes from that as well. But I was seeing 50% saving. That's not that won't apply for all projects, but definitely one large project we were getting that. And I think on one of the first projects we did, which was a very had 700 or 800 test cases, it was around 40% saving, I think.
So one feedback I did get about the screenplay, and this was early on, I don't know if it's easier now, is it seemed to be complicated or a lot of over engineering almost. Is it because someone maybe didn't understand the implementation of the screenplay plan, or does it take a little more upfront cost or time, but in the end you end up saving in the long run?
I think it's like the transition from, if you're going between a procedural programming model and you go to object-oriented, or if you go from OO to functional, it seems complex at first because you're changing the way you think. But what I've found is that when we show Screenplay to developers or developers with a bit of experience, often they'll pick it up, or testers with a development background who have seen a few different ways of coding and who have experience with real-world applications. The Screenplay pattern is effectively a combination of the command pattern and the builder pattern. It comes down to no and OO patterns, and then a fairly functional style of coding. It's very easy to pick up for someone who's already come across that before. And I've also seen, we had one project where it was a lot of quite junior testers who had relatively little automation experience. And we found that if we sat with them for a day and explained the concepts, they picked it up quite quickly. But not only that, it made it easier to scale safely because we could get the less experienced testers to basically assemble Lego blocks of existing tasks, and then the more experienced testers to actually implement the more complex tasks. We'd have tasks like given a customer as a high risk, given Joe as a high risk customer, and then Joe would come from Argentina and have dodgy relations or something like that. This was a compliance application. And then behind the scenes, that would create a batch file, which would submit a batch operation to a mainframe to set up some test data. It was horrible, but Screenplay made it a lot easier. And what that did was that was quite a complex interaction to do, but we could still scale it. The testers with less experience would just use it like a Lego block and didn't have to know about the complexity.
Awesome. So I would highly recommend then, John, that people do pick up this book. So I'm pretty sure you covered the screenplay pattern in here as well. Is that correct?
Yes, there are several chapters on Screenplay, and it explains it right from the very start.
Okay, John, before we go, is there one piece of actionable advice you can give to someone to help them with their automation testing or BDD efforts? And what's the best way to find or contact you?
Best way to get in touch is, LinkedIn works well. That's the way to get directly in touch. For the Serenity Dojo training program, there I can put a link, a URL where you can get in touch as well and chat, or we can have a chat. LinkedIn's probably the best way to get directly in touch.
And one piece of actionable advice you'd give to someone to help them with their automation testing or BDD efforts?
Focus on keeping the code clean. What I find is that simplicity and clean code goes a long way, and people tend to make their code more complex, make their code complicated. And when I say complicated, it doesn't necessarily mean complicated patterns or design or whatever, but just long and convoluted and overthought. There are a lot of, Serenity does a lot of stuff in the background. It's not all automation frameworks do a lot of stuff that can allow you to code in a more simple way, a higher level way. That's what you want to aim for. Make sure your code actually does what it says and says what it does. And that's kind of the art of writing simple code. It doesn't have to be too simple. It has to be simple enough to do the job it's supposed to do. But the quality of the automation code is sort of the key to keeping things maintainable.
Thanks again for your automation awesomeness. The links to everything of value we covered in this episode, head on over to testguild.com A449. And if the show has helped you in any way, why not rate it and review it in iTunes? Reviews really help in the rankings of the show, and I read each and every one of them. So that's it for this episode of the Test Guild Automation Podcast. I'm Joe, and my mission is to help you succeed with creating end-to-end, full-stack automation awesomeness. As always, test everything and keep the good. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to the Test Guild Automation Podcast. Head on over to testguild.com for full show notes, amazing blog articles, and online testing conferences. Don't forget to subscribe to the Guild to continue your testing journey.